Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode and all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Today's guest is joining us from the United States. He's visiting for the GPU conference. He's a renowned scholar of Quranic studies and the founder of Bayyinah Institute, and that's none other than Ustad Nouman Ali Khan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you?
I'm well, alhamdulillah.
How's London treating you?
As always, I come here often, so I'm kind of used to.
Took you long to get out of the hotel room today. How come?
Yeah, I was out and baby was... I didn't want to put him through a whole long day of being in the car because I barely get through that in London, but we're just too attached to each other, so
MashaAllah.
I couldn't do it in the end. So the negotiations took long.
Okay. How are you looking forward to the GPU? Because they're doing this after some years now.
Yeah. It's going to bring back some interesting memories. Actually, the first time I left the US to speak publicly abroad was the GPU. So it was my first international trip, and it was the UK. One
of the most well-known engagements you used to do was a story time. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Those are one of your most popular...
Yeah, story nights, yeah.
Are we going to have those story nights again?
There's a small version of that at the GPU itself.
Yep.
I've been doing story nights across Europe and inshallah soon Southeast Asia this year. But I've been working on something new, a new story night, probably my 12th one now, inshallah. Probably start next year.
How's training?
It's okay. London's depressing for me.
Okay.
Because these engagements, there's so many of them that I don't get to do my normal routine. So it breaks the routine, but I'm surviving.
Besides weights, are you doing anything else?
I do at least 20,000, between 16 and 20,000 steps a day.
Okay.
I try to keep that on my average.
Do you like basketball? I'm sure I've seen you play basketball.
Yeah, I'm so out of it. And there's a lot of training I need. I'm keeping up with weights, but there's a lot of mobility training and athletic training that I'm going to try to go back to.
Alhamdulillah.
Because as you age, I've noticed at least I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I don't have the kind of mobility that I used to have. So even though I play ball still every once in a while, I know I've slowed down quite a bit. So I want to keep up. My youngest son's 15 months almost, and in 10 years' time, I need to own him on the basketball court. So,
what's your views on the UK Islamic scene? I mean, you've been visiting here often, and the flavour is certainly different across the pond.
Sure.
What's your general thoughts on the UK dawah scene, and how does it differ to perhaps the States, North America?
I don't want to sound like I know generally. I'll start with my impression of the American dawah scene. I think Americans generally, and then American Muslims by extension, suffered for a long time from a similar problem. A sort of we're on top of the world and we're looking down at everybody else syndrome. We've got it figured out and everybody else is just catching up, right? I, alhamdulillah, don't suffer from that syndrome. I find myself learning phenomenal things from Muslims from around the world and cultures from around the world. And it opens my eyes to the kind of bubble I live in, or many of us live in the U.S. There are advantages to being in the U.S. and the Muslim scene. I think as far as community development, we're far ahead of what Europe has been able to do. And I think England is ahead of the pack in Europe as far as Muslim community development. But even we're still significantly further, maybe 30 years ahead of you guys, even though we started much later, right? And there are many factors behind that.
Do you think socioeconomics is one of the factors?
Socioeconomics, the kind of immigration that happened here, the kind of ghettoization of Muslims that was going on here for a long time. The upward mobility of Muslims in the United States is a much faster trajectory. And the entrepreneurial spirit of the country, Muslims are generally more entrepreneurial anyway. So that's played to our favor. So, which is why we've been able to build much more and much more quickly.
Let me ask you something before we kick off the crux of today's conversation. Do you think, I don't like the term ghettoization, but the kind of the natural inclination to live amongst your own, to live in the Muslim bubbles, hence why you have East London, Birmingham, Bradford. There's cons to it, but do you see some pros to it? Because some of the Brits would argue that it is this very ghettoization that kind of preserves our identity and the shadidness of our faith and identity.
So I don't confuse faith with cultural identity. Okay. So let's separate those two first off. And I'm speaking with my American bias.
Can they overlap?
They can, to some extent. They can also become a problem.
Okay.
So what happens is, if I come from Pakistan and I move to the UK, for instance, I bring Islam with me, but I also bring a lot of Pakistan with me.
Of course.
Right?
Nice.
And to me, actually, there's no line between the two. They're actually one and the same for me. So losing one is like losing the other. The problem with that also is the fusion between the culture and the religion is so deep that you don't know where the religion ends and the culture begins. And so when there are some things in the culture that are not sustainable in this new environment, and you have to rethink them, you start thinking, oh my God, I'm going to lose my Islam because I'm losing my culture. You're not. Islam is well and good. You're simply shedding some parts of that culture, right? So that's one of the advantages of the U.S. in that. And one thing I'll openly say about European Muslim experience, is much more difficult to be Muslim here than it is in the U.S., contrary to many people's opinion.
Really?
Yes.
Because people would think post 9/11, the Muslims were living literally under the belly of the...
Oh, no. We have an amazing life as Muslims in the United States. I've traveled the world engaging with Muslims, and the kind of freedom I feel to operate in the U.S., I haven't felt anywhere in the world, rarely in a place or two. The thing is, British Muslims, even now, they're having conversations about, we're British too. We're still having that conversation. We stopped having that conversation 30 years ago. We're not saying, oh, we have arrived, we're Americans too. That's an old conversation. England is still better off, but if you go to, I often give examples of places like Germany and France, where you can have Muslims that their father was a Turkish guy, father was born in Berlin, grandfather was born in Hamburg, but they're Turkish origin, and the grandson, born and raised in Germany, doesn't even know any Turkish. Guess how he's seen in that society? A Turk. He's not seen as a German, right? You walk into a donut shop in America, you'll a Latino, a black person, a Filipino, a Bangladeshi, a Pakistani, just American. You're just American. Like, it's not a color thing anymore, right? It's not a race thing anymore. But so national identity overrides now racial identity, even though racial politics is being exasperated for other reasons. On the ground, nobody cares. Do you
think there's a healthy balance between patriotism and your Islamic identity?
I think they're two distinct things. It's like...
Can both exist in one person?
Absolutely. I think patriotism has a variety of definitions, right?
American patriotism.
Sure. I love the U.S. I love it to death. And I despise the politics of the United States, and I'm disgusted by what's being done in the U.S. politically, and how our politicians are bought and paid for. And I personally have conversations with friends of mine that are veterans.
That are waking up to this.
That are waking up to this.
Yep.
These non-Muslims. And I'm like, you bled for this country, and look at how it's being sold. It boils my blood to know that you bled, and this is what's happening to our country, right? And this is a new awakening that's happening in the U.S. It's a little late, but it's happening. And the cat's not going to go back in the bag.
Do you think Gaza contributes that significantly?
Hugely. I think Gaza was going on forever. Gaza is in its worst state now, but this plan... We Muslims know this. This is not news to us, what's been going on in Gaza. We've been crying about it not since October 7. We've been crying about it
since 48.
Yeah. So, but the fact that, a high school girl sitting in Wyoming can get on her TikTok channel and cry about it. So, right? That's a new world.
That's what happened before.
That's not happened before. If I can find conservative Christians in evangelical churches, old white guys discussing why are some of our government officials carrying 2 passports? When that's I could never imagine that would be the case.
20 years ago.
5 years ago. You couldn't imagine that. So the things are changing very rapidly, and I don't know where things are going to settle. I can't tell.
Do you think it'll die out with the boomer generation? Because ultimately the kind of hardcore support for Israel in America tends to come from that generation.
I don't think it'll die out in that way, but what I do think is the conversation about Israel, about American influence, in the region and about Israeli influence on American politics, actually, that conversation is only going to get bigger and louder, and not just in Muslim circles, I don't think. So that's something that now even friends I have that are connected with government, friends that are connected with like military, even the intelligence communities, etc. They're saying these are the conversations that are now erupting in chambers of power, which is a new development.
That's enough politics for now.
Yeah.
Let's get to the crux of the conversation.
Sure.
I want to start off by asking some warm-up questions.
Okay.
You may think to yourself, hey, these are quite simple questions, but the thing is, you'd think that many Muslims would know the answer, but they wouldn't. So I'm going to ask you if...
Yeah, I don't assume people don't know background information. That's fine.
Why is the Quran, why was it not compiled in chronological order?
Okay, so let's think about this a little bit differently. The Quran had two purposes. The Quran came to aid the Prophet in a mission that was going to last 23 years, right? And a mission is made up of many objectives. And each of those objectives, he's going to be directed to the next objective, sallallahu, by the coming of the next revelation. And the next revelation, he doesn't know which way to turn or what to do in the situation. A revelation is going to come. Then one's going to come. Then another's going to come. And basically the revelation is guiding his movement, his mission, to its final objective. Okay? So that's the first objective of revelation, to let the Prophet ﷺ see through the mission that Allah has given him, right? It's his blueprint for what to do, essentially, right? Not just spiritually, but even in terms of the strategy of dawah, whether or not to make hijrah, who's the enemy, how to fight him, how to identify. All of that stuff is coming from revelation to him, right? Now Islam is victorious. Makkah has been conquered. Islam is no longer a mission. Islam is now a civilization. We're an ummah now, and victory has come. You're seeing hordes and hordes of people coming and entering into Islam. Okay. Now the Quran has a second objective. Guidance not for a mission, guidance for a civilization. And that civilization is going to last until Judgment Day. And then people will join that civilization and they'll say, hey, how do I become a constructive and a productive and a meaningful member of this ummah, of this civilization, right? The Quran's order, as was finally decided by Allah and instructed to the Prophet ﷺ, that he recited in the order that we have now. This order, the design of it, is actually meant to give a Muslim a proper education in what Islam is and how to think about Islam until Judgment Day. So it's actually, in a sense, you know how a curriculum is all about how you sequence things?
Yep.
This is the divine curriculum on how a Muslim should develop their thoughts about Islam. So they should start with Fatiha, go to Baqarah, go to Al Imran. Like when someone says to me, how do I study the Quran? Where should I begin? Should I begin with the short surahs? I say, no, why would you begin with the short surahs? Begin with the beginning.
Who decided the order?
This is divine. This is revealed. I taught a course on this subject. I'll give you the highlights. Okay. There are 3 ways to prove that this is revealed order. I know in our tradition, an opinion exists that this is also something that the companions agreed upon. I would strongly disagree with that position. I respect it, but I strongly disagree with it. And I give 3 layers of evidence. The first evidence is historical. Let's talk about that briefly. First of all, it's reported clearly that the Prophet ﷺ recited the entire Quran in this order twice before the angel Jibreel alayhi in the last year of revelation. And he even had, I believe it was Zayd ibn Thabit, was a witness to the second recitation.
In its current
order.
From Surah Al-Fatiha to Surah An-Nas.
There you go. Now, when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is commissioning the compilation of the Quran, and later on Uthman is doing so, who is he putting in charge of the compilation project? The very same companion who heard the Prophet recite the entire Quran for this, Zayd. So it's inconceivable that he would agree to any order other than the one that was given to him by the Prophet. Number 1. Number 2, when the Sahaba do something that the Prophet didn't do, right? They do something new. Like, let's put the Quran in written form. Is Abu Bakr jumping into that project, or is he reluctant about putting the Quran in? He's reluctant. Why? Because they don't want to touch something about the Book of Allah that the Prophet didn't do. Okay. If we're saying the companions got together and said, hey, let's make Baqarah 2 and Ali Imran 3, you would have an exhaustive record of the discussions to justify 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, all the way to Surah An-Nas 114.
And opposition to it, if it
And opposition, and say, how can you do this? The Prophet never said this, right? Or I think this, or I think that, right? Or even, hey, but this wasn't revealed first. You have zero record of such discussion, zero. When is the only time you have zero record? Let me show you. Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs. You don't see exhaustive discussion on Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs. We just do it.
Yep.
The adhan is the adhan. There's no exhaustive discussion on the we just do it.
Yep.
Right? You say salam this way first and this way second. There's exhaustive discussion, or you just do it? No. When there is something coming from the Prophet ﷺ that's so recurring and so established that it doesn't even need discussion, then that we're looking for some kind of a textual evidence. Actually, a lack of textual evidence becomes the biggest historical evidence of the established order.
So just to clarify, in simpleton language, you're saying where there is an opinion that this was a consensus amongst the Sahaba, you're more so the position that no, the Prophet ﷺ recited this in the order that we have it twice, and the lack of evidence of the discussion is proof of that.
And in fact, the consensus of the Sahaba could only have happened if this was established by the Prophet ﷺ, because there's no recorded discussion on coming to a consensus. None.
So why is the position that you adopted different to the one that you stated that you disagree with?
Because once you say that this is consensus of the companions, then you're attributing the logic of this order to human beings. But if you say that this is divine order, then the order has divine significance, just like when we say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Malik Yawmiddin has an order, and that order is there for a reason, and we can learn something from that order. If Fatiha is first, Baqarah is second, Ali Imran is third, is in this order from Allah's design, then even that order has significance, and it's divine significance, as opposed to human significance. Makes a complete difference, doesn't it? Now we're treating this order itself as revelation, as opposed to treating it as an ijtihad.
Sure.
Right?
Which brings me on to my next question. You were most famously known in the earlier years of, discussing the linguistic miracles of the Quran and so forth. Is the Arabic language the only miracle of the Quran?
So, I don't frame that anymore in that way.
Okay.
So I'll tell you my thoughts on the miracle of the Quran briefly. So Allah gives us His final revelation, and if you look at it from a linguist looks at it from a linguistic perspective, they might find some incredibly profound things that they will find humanly impossible, right? From their perspective. But I'll give you an analogy to make sense of this. If I dove into the ocean and I found myself a pearl, and I came out and I said, look at this amazing pearl, and somebody else says, it's not that shiny. So I've seen better. What are you talking about? You think that's a pearl? Let me show you this other pearl. Now, this is what you call a pearl. So I can make some observations and be amazed by these observations. But that doesn't guarantee that somebody else will come along and say, I'm amazed by the same observations you are. They may say, You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the idea of finding marvelous things in the Quran is actually a product of tadabbur, of contemplation in the Quran. And it does help a human being arrive at the divine essence of this book. But that doesn't mean that the observation I made about it linguistically is now the ultimate proof of its divinity. It's the ultimate proof of its divinity, or these evidences are for me, but they may not necessarily be for someone else.
So why is the Quran regarded as the greatest miracle?
Because it doesn't cease to illustrate its divinity from a limitless number of perspectives. Like linguistics is just one dimension of an endless diamond that has multi faces.
Mathematical, scientific,
historical, comparative, religious. Like the way Allah, for example, talked about the Catholic Church and the ongoings of the Catholic Church inside the walls of the Catholic Church. Some of the most confidential stuff that nobody had access. The general Christian public did not have access to what was going on behind the scenes in the Catholic Church. And Allah will come out and comment on it hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from the cathedrals in the Arabian desert, as if he's intimately familiar with the ongoings of what's going on. How? Right? And then Orientalists come along and say, well, he must have had some information from the Christian.
Plagiarized.
Okay, then he has information from mariners about deep sea life. He has information from the Christians, from Jewish scribes. He has information about ancient Sumeria, and he has information about the ancient Egyptians and things we're discovering in Egyptology in just the last 100 years. He has information about how. Now you're saying he had access to the internet. So it's, and the more, even now I'm very much a student of the Quran. 80% of my work life is Quran study now, right? And whenever I'm studying another surah or restudying another surah, honestly, my team and I at the end of that study were like, wow, that didn't see that coming. That's incredible. Like, how does Allah do that? And we are ashamed of ourselves at the end of every study. You know why? Because we come into a surah thinking we know what this is about. We got this. And at the end of it, we're like humbled. So the miraculous power of the Quran is something I believe the invitation to humanity is, come and engage with this book with an open mind and let it make its case for itself. And there are historians that will read this book and it will make a case to them. There are linguists, literaries, it will make a case to them. There may be people that are struggling with philosophical issues. My first engagement with the Quran wasn't even about linguistics. My first engagement with the Quran was as an agnostic. I was agnostic, bordering on atheism. And I heard a commentary on the Quran by my teacher in Urdu. And I was taking four elective philosophy courses in college just because I was eating this stuff up.
So when you had the verse, it was in Urdu, English, or Arabic?
It was Arabic, then Urdu. Like, he would read the Arabic, then he just translated in Urdu. But the cool thing was he didn't have a translation in front of him. So he was just speaking the translation, right? So it sounded more natural. The cool thing was, as he was going through, I think it was by the time he got to Ali Imran, I had just heard Baqarah and I had just heard Ali Imran for the first time in my life. I must have been 17, 18 years old. He kept undoing all these knots in my head about, philosophy of ethics and relative ethics and atheism. And, there's a bunch of issues I had in my head and all of them started getting undone. And the guy, he was a dentist. He doesn't even know philosophy. He's just discussing Quran. And he has no idea I'm sitting there with this background. And he has no idea what he's doing for me because he's not doing it. It's the Quran that's doing it. So my first engagement with the miraculousness of the Quran had nothing to do with me wanting to seek out the miraculousness of the Quran. It was just me, let me just listen to this as an eager learner and let it open itself up to me, right?
Charity is just a band-aid solution. In 2024, charity alone isn't enough. In 2024, is donating enough? Because giving charity to the oppressed only treats their symptoms. It's like putting a plaster over a deep wound. It's important and needed, but it doesn't fix the problem. But speaking up against the oppressors can cure the disease. Help and support organizations like Human Aid and Advocacy that do both. Humanitarian aid is crucial, but fighting for justice brings real change. As Muslims, it's our duty to stand up for the truth. Do your part by supporting Human Aid and Advocacy. Next question. You'll hear very common when Muslims engage with Christians or people of other faith, they'll say, hey, our book is preserved, unchanged, unlike your book. In polemics between Christians and other faiths, our book is perfectly preserved and so forth. How would you explain the haruf or like the way the Quran is recited, the oratory tradition? Is it bulletproof? Is it watertight? I mean, just otherwise it would be very controversial.
No, I don't believe it is.
No?
No, I don't believe that it's not bulletproof. I'll tell you exactly what I believe. I believe that we have to go back to the basic conception. When Islam started and Islam took power, and the people, the followers of the Prophet ﷺ were now in a position of power. The vast majority of these people don't come from a literary background. They don't have publishing ability. They don't have documentation ability. And even if the Quran's been documented, it's been documented in one or two manuscripts, while thousands of people have already become, if not hundreds of thousands, have become Muslim. And they're spread all over. And there's no way to control what they've memorized. There's no way to control what they're spreading. There's no governmental agency that says, hey, don't say it like that, say it like this. And by the time a Sahabi or a Tabi'i has reached Iraq, and another one's reached Abyssinia, another one's almost on the shores of China or wherever,
or next to Spain,
it's too late. It's too late. So you know what should happen? What should happen is these 114 surahs and this Quran, what should happen with it is there should be a variety. Memory should fail, and somebody might miss an ayah in Baqarah, and then they passed on the Surah Al-Baqarah with a missing ayah. Or somebody might mess up the order of the surahs from 114 surahs, so 114 times 113 times 112. That's how many permutations of sequences are possible, right? So some variety should be there. And the more the oral tradition spreads, the more variety should spread. And then finally, when we have a published mushaf, there should already be contentious, hey, that's not how I recite it. But again, you don't find that. Why? Because the Western, the European and the Eurocentric academic looks at the written record as the primary source. That's why they carbon date and all this stuff. And if I can find a carbon dated copy, then I can say this is what was the authentic. And they reject the oral tradition because human memory is weak. Sounds very logical. Except it doesn't work with the Quran. It's the opposite. Why? Because if oral tradition is in fact weak, you ever heard of the game of telephone? Of course, right? I did telephone with my kids in one of the programs. It was 100 kids. And I put in his ear, Bob punched Joe, right? Get to the 100th kid. You know what he said? Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.
Do you know what's crazy? That was the political correct terminology for the game. We call it Chinese whispers. I know that's not politically correct now. That's why it's called Chinese whispers.
So now imagine, obviously that's a game that to illustrate the flawed nature of human memory, right? And if you apply that principle to the Quran, and we all acknowledge the Quran was not in predominantly written form in its earliest stage, right? The published Quran phenomenon is a later development. Even when Uthman is binding the Mus'haf as one Mus'haf, even then it's already too late. We're not looking at it in 3D, we're looking at it in 2D, like this was the Quran. No, the Quran was already everywhere, right? Then what should happen within 10 years? What should happen within 20 years? There should be 10,000 varieties, 20 million varieties. I don't care how many. The numbers should be enormous. But there wasn't. They're not. And there's no conspiracy. You have to come up with an amazing conspiracy theory to kill all the people or to eliminate all
who differed or disagreed.
Who differ or disagree. Yeah. It doesn't make any historical sense. So I always wondered, how are Western academics so blind to this blatant historical truth, right? Until I went to one of the ICSA conventions in Italy, in Palermo, and one of the Western academics actually made their PhD thesis, the oral tradition overrides the arguments of the written tradition, integrity of the Quran. So the Orientalists that were challenging the integrity of the Quran 20, 30 years ago, their arguments, if you keep up with what Orientalists are doing now, they're starting to realize this is outdated. So Muslims need to keep up. Like even the kuffar got bored with their arguments, bro.
Let me ask you this. Is there a consensus, or was there a consensus amongst the Sahaba, or from your knowledge from the scholars of Quran, about which verses were taken literally and which were supposed to be taken metaphorically?
No.
So there's no ijma on what is...
No. The best we can do is we can look at qarina. Yeah. Qarina means that there's a phrase in the Arabic language. Can we find evidence that the Arabs were using this phrase in particular figuratively? Is there any precedent for them normally talking? Like, for example, we say we're just chilling, right? But it's hot in here. How are you chilling? For example, right? So now it's a figure of speech. Oh man, that game was fire. But it had nothing to do with fire, right? So these are cultural expressions. Now you look up fire in the linguistic dictionary and you're going to find something that burns and blah, 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 right? And you may not find the colloquial usage of your time. But the Arab poetic record, and the Arabs had 5 kinds of literature before Islam that survived.
Which one?
The wasaya, the kind of the elders giving counsel to the as they're about to die. They know they're going to die soon. They're going to give advice to the village, right? Kind of sage counsel, you can call it, right? Khutbah. So they would give public speeches. Khutbah was also like, oh, I want you to marry my niece, and here's the merits of our tribe, blah blah blah. Of course, poetry was a big. Then Saj'un Kuhana, like the soothsayers, they would speak in rhyme, and they would try to sound mysterious, and then tell you what the dead are telling you, like the spirits are spoken to me, and I speak about the leaves and the trees and the bees and blah, blah, blah. Like they'll do this kind of nonsense, right? So these were some of the genres that survived, and then of course Nathar, which is plain speech. Mm-hmm. So we have quite a bit of that. And from it, you can derive how the Arabs were engaging with their language and how the Quran was engaging with the existing language, right? So studying pre-Islamic literature becomes extremely, extremely important for that reason, because it gives you the answer to were the Arabs used to hearing this thing figuratively or literally, right? And some people come on and say there's nothing figurative in the Quran. Well, really, then find a straight road, because Allah says guide us to a straight path. It starts with a figurative expression, right? There's lots of figurative. In fact, the Arabs, in some literaries would even say al-Arabiyya kulluha majaz. Like it's almost the entire language is figurative in some way or the other, right? But we don't go the Christian route of figurative speech. The Christian route of figurative speech is the Lord said there shall be rain, right? You know what that means? In your life, it's going to rain soon. Your paycheck's going to rain. What are you talking about, bro? You just took something from here and something from here, So this is not the kind of figurative analysis that genuine scholarship ever did. But did they say, hey, look, there's precedence for this in language, and this is why this makes more sense, and here's a suggestion for why this can be taken figuratively. Now, as a student of tafsir, I can tell you there are many cases in which the same ayah can be looked at literally and figuratively, and you can learn much from both dimensions.
How can Aqimus Salah be taken figuratively and not literally? Established prayer.
Aqimus Salah is literal, and it has figurative layers.
Okay.
So you can call them, if you want to understand the Balaghi terminology in simple speech, you can say there's the primary intent and there's secondary layers. So what's the secondary layer? The word Salah comes from Sila or Wasl. And Sila can mean two things. It can mean connection. So not only should you pray, but you should seek to maintain a relationship with God through the prayer. So now the substance of the prayer, the form of the prayer has now been merged with the spirit of the prayer in one phrase. But the word sila also comes from sad lam waw, which actually sala yaslu means to put a thick wooden stick in the fire so that it gets softer, so you can straighten it. Right? So establish uprightness, as if Allah is saying you standing upright in prayer is you actually uprighting your character.
By stretching out.
By putting yourself through rigorous training, like the stick is put in rigorous fire.
Okay.
Right? And it's what it does is it takes all the bark and all the weak elements of the wood and it burns them off. That's why actually yaslawna jahannam in the Quran, the same verb is used for people being cast into Jahannam. Right? Because they're cast in a fire. So you're literally shedding impurities through this exercise, and that's part of Aqimus Salah. There's another dimension now, since we're talking about that. What is Salat? What is the biggest part of Salah? Reciting Quran. When you're reciting the Quran, Allah is telling you, for example, give to the orphan, give to the poor, qulu qawlan sadida, speak straightforward, right? Don't be a cheat, kunu ma'a salihin, be with good people, etc., etc. And you're praying and you're like, oh, I just lied to my uncle. I just lied to my boss. And so what are you going to do? You're going to go and you're going to put yourself in the fire and actually tell the truth, because God just told you that, and you told God back, this is what I'm going to do. So you're straightening yourself out by praying. So these secondary meanings are profound. And to say, oh, well, no, it just means be spiritually connected to Allah. Like, let's deny the literal meaning. No, it's stupid to deny the literal meaning, but it's also an injustice to ignore the figurative beauty that came with it, right? So it's multidimensional. That's part of the beauty of the Quran.
Are there any verses of the Quran? I know some verses of the Quran were abrogated, but is there, from your understanding, are there any parts or aspects of the Quran which are inapplicable for certain times?
It's something I struggle with, and I'll be blunt about my opinion. I don't believe there is abrogation in the Quran.
You don't?
No, I do not believe that. I believe there's progression in the Quran, tadrij, but I don't believe there's nasakh in the Quran.
So can I ask you, as an example, so there's a verse of the Quran, please tell me, because I don't know exactly which surah, where Allah says, the Christians and the Sabians who believe in Allah on the final day, that they may attain Jannah.
Sure.
Do you know which verse I'm talking
about? Yeah.
But then in the latter verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that you have to believe in Allah and the Messenger.
So this is, okay, I'll help you out with that one. Nothing wrong with that ayah. And I'll tell you why. Because context is everything in the Quran. Allah says, أُحْكِمَتْ آيَاتُهُ. The ayat of the Quran are stitched to each other. They're stitched together. Now, if I have a piece of knit cloth or wool, and I pull one string out, then I'm violating its stitching.
Did I get the verses right?
You got the verse right, but you're joining one ayah from one stitching to another ayah from another stitching. So let's understand the stitching. The stitching is the Israelites. The Israelites are being told, believe in what has now come down to this prophet. And there's like, oh, so everybody before was wrong? Everybody was just going to Jahannam? Allah says, no, anybody who believed and did good. In fact, before the coming of this prophet, even among the Christians, among the Jews, whoever was doing right, none of their deeds are going to be taken away. It's actually commenting on something that we're making them say, well, does that mean we were all wrong all along? Right? It's in that vein the conversation's happening. It's not, we became accustomed in the digital age to search for a subject in the Quran and pull out an ayah and not look at how Allah actually placed that ayah inside of a context. Just like you and I talking now, you can take a sentence of what I say, make it into a short form clip.
I'm going to do that.
Inshallah. If not, there are plenty of people that are ready to. And they're going to do that. And what's going to happen is what I was saying will be completely misconstrued. Why? Because simply when you have 4 or 5 dots and you want to draw a line through them, you can only draw one line through them. But if you have one data point, one dot, you can draw an infinite number of lines through it, right? What do we do with an ayah a lot of times? We have this one data point and we start drawing a number of conclusions from it. Instead of saying, no, this ayah belongs inside of a context. And that's this is the first principle of understanding the Quran. First understand what surah, what passage, what overall discourse does this ayah belong to? What's its original place? I'll tell you, ignoring that it leads to the craziest things. I'll give you an example of that. Allah says, for instance, what example was I? Oh yeah, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهِ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. The ones who truly fear Allah among His slaves are the ulama. Okay. I was talking to you about textual context. Let's, for a moment, look at historical context. If you were going to translate ulama into English, what would you say?
The most common is scholars.
Okay, scholars. The ayah is Makki. So it's revealed in Makkah. There are no scholars in Makkah. But they're Bedouin Arabs. And even the ones that became Muslim know some surahs here and there. Right? And the only scholars that we're going to see in the seerah are going to be scholars of the Jews. They're called ulama. So now if we're translating this as scholars, we're being historically inaccurate.
Because there are no
scholars.
Yeah.
The ulama literally means people in the know, people who know. Allah is saying people who truly know who God is.
The people of knowledge would be better
knowledge.
Would that be a better translation?
Yes. The knowledgeable. Even knowledgeable has become a coined phrase in our culture, right? You have to decouple it from our existing culture. People that have come to know, people that know Allah, people that know the truth, are the ones that truly have fear of it. It's as if Allah is saying, you cannot be a fearful, God-conscious person if you don't truly arrive, you don't come to knowledge of what the truth actually is first. That was the original conversation, which means this is an open invitation for everyone to become ulama. But in our cultural understanding of this ayah, we say the only people that truly fear Allah are the mufti sahib or the sheikh. Because our concept of ulama is a culturally derived. This is not the original meaning, right? So historical context, textual context, absolutely essential. And do we believe about people of the fatra, people that came before Islam? Even think about people that were in China, hypothetically, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Think about Christians that were living in the Levant, no access to the Prophet ﷺ, and they died. The Prophet has come, Meccan Quran has already been revealed, the Romans and the Persians are fighting each other, as we know, right? And some of them, sincere Christians, died, right? And the question is, are they in Jahannam or are they not in Jahannam? And the Quran is answering this question. Clearly in Surah Al-Baqarah, those that have been exposed to the revelation are answerable. And those that just died without knowing, then among them Allah will see who truly believed and didn't believe, and He will judge him on his merits. He has a system of holding a human being responsible based on what He made available to them. He will not punish them for something He never gave them access to. So even while being Christian, Jews, whatever, if they still believed in Allah and the last day, and did good deeds, they meet Allah's standard. What a beautiful thing to say. And it doesn't diminish from the exclusivity of Islam in any way, right? But the problem is we have this black and white mentality. Either you are exclusivist for Islam or you're a perennialist, where everything goes. And the thing is, the moment we become obsessed with boxes is when the Qur'an's understanding suffers.
Do you want to make a real difference for Palestine? Here's your chance. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? What is your Islam worth if you remain silent in the face of a genocide? Every bombing in Palestine tests your faith. As Muslims, it's our duty to stand against oppression. Our beloved Prophet ﷺ said, "Whoever among you sees evil, let him change it with his hand. If he's unable to do so, then let his tongue speak against it. And the lowest form of Iman is to hate it from within." Right now, our brothers and sisters in Palestine are suffering terrible persecution. 120,000 people have been martyred, 70% of whom were women and children. But what have you done about it? Help make a real change by supporting both aid and advocacy for Palestine. Apart from delivering aid, Human Aid has been advocating for the rights of Palestinians since 2010. Help support Human Aid and advocacy to support real change. So staying on that theme, especially when you mention ulama, from a deeper Quranic reflective point of view, how would one extrapolate seeking knowledge? Whether that be from short form content online and social media, which is very common in today's times.
Yeah.
Is there a more deeper Quranic approach to seeking knowledge?
It's really simple. Honestly, the Quran was a revelation in knowledge. It was a revolution in knowledge. Look, the Christian religion was a dominant religious force in the world, okay? And the other pagan religions in the world, like Hinduism and Buddhism, with the other civilizations, right? Mm-hmm. They had something in common. And what that was the religious class was a special clergy that had special buildings assigned to them.
That was separate to the laity.
Separate to the laity, and their knowledge was classified. You have to go through them to access that knowledge. And if you try to access that knowledge and you touch even a copy of the Bible and you're a low class, you might be executed.
This was the case in Europe right up until the Middle Ages.
That's correct. So now Quran comes, and the first revelation is Iqra bismi rabbik. Read. What do you mean read?
Me?
Read? What, are you allowed? Read what? In the name of your Rabb. Read Revelation. Wait. I have access to Revelation? What? That's not how that works. You're supposed to have a class and hierarchy and go through a certain, right? So the Quran brought about an intellectual revolution whereby people can access God's word directly. This was unheard of, unthinkable in the religions of the world, across the religion. This is unthinkable. Now, when Islam spreads, the way I ask this question, how does someone go about learning their religion now in the age of information? I say the best answers to that is the further back you go and try to think about this, the better answer you're going to get. Islam just became victorious, and it spread to Abyssinia, and it means some parts of India. Now imagine you're living in Abyssinia, and now you met a Muslim. What's the Muslim going to tell you? The Muslim's going to tell you, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Hey, can I learn that? Yeah, I can teach you. What does it mean? I can tell you what it says.
That's exactly what happened.
That's how Islam spread. And we say the best generations are the earliest generations. And what do? They kept things simple. They just spread the Quran. The spreading of the Quran was the spreading of Islam. Now we say, no. You should take a Sirah class, then you should take a fiqh class, then you should take a Aqidah class, then you should take a and inshallah, you might become somewhat guided. But be careful. Where did you come up with? Okay, I don't diss or diminish the value of the Islamic sciences. They have a profound value. But when someone's seeking the truth, like someone just goes into the library and picks up a copy of the translation of the Quran, even a bad translation, and starts reading it and starts getting moved by it. And he said, no, brother. Hold on, let me get you a tafsir. And then let me get you the opinions of all the tabi'een before you understand. What are you doing?
Have you created a clergy class, do you think?
Absolutely. We did many things right, and everything we did right has a dark side. So the ulama tradition, the alim tradition we created is profound. It's one of the most amazing accomplishments in human civilization, but it has a dark side, right? We are masters of spirituality. It has a dark side, right? We have amazing jurist, it has a dark side. So, and the problem is Muslims, when they they have this romantic relationship with their tradition, everything is glorious.
Which is normal. It's human instinct. Especially when you're perceived as a battered nation, you seek romanticism.
Listen to what I'm saying here.
And a sense of comfort.
The Israelites only like to look at the glorious chapters of their history. Okay?
Dawud alayhi salam, Sulaiman alayhi salam.
Yeah, and what did the Quran do? It highlighted all the dark chapters in Surah Al-Baqarah and say, this is you too.
Mm-hmm.
What's Allah teaching the Muslims?
Don't follow those same steps.
You have to be completely self-aware. Me as an individual, I need to know my strengths, but I can't just look at myself in the mirror and look at I need to identify my weaknesses. I need to identify my dark sides, my failings. There are failings in Islamic history, and that doesn't dismiss the tradition. This means we're human.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so we become highly insecure when anything is challenging any part of our tradition, because then if you just pull one thing out, the whole thing's going to collapse. It's not a house of cards. It's not that weak. But we are committed not to heritage. We're committed to truth. And it may be that the people that came before us were truly sincere and they did the best they could, but they made some lapses in judgment. It's possible. Or they didn't have enough information. Or they believe something to be true, but that's not part of Islam. That's part of their understanding of Islam. But the moment you start pulpifying the tradition and you start saying its sanctity is unquestionable. Who are you to question right? Then one, you're not a student of history, because our entire history is scholars questioning other scholars.
But is there a line to be drawn where it becomes excessive, where it can lead you to another extreme where everything's up for redefinition?
You know what the line is? Does it meet the criteria of evidence? That's al-haq. The Quran has given a line. If you are if you have something substantive to say, it better stand on the merits of evidence. That's it. And this is what makes Islam so powerful. It's not saying, no, some things show some respect. No. The only thing we have respect for is ja al-haq was a haq al-batil. That's it.
I get that. Entrepreneurship. Now, in the earlier days of Bayyinah, were you reliant on public funds?
Earlier days, for the campus.
Yeah.
For just the campus.
Most Muslim organizations, at least in the UK, are still very much reliant on the Ummah's support, right?
So the way I did that...
Is there a Quranic approach to move away from a reliance on public funds and become more of a giving type organization? Because you'd think that a dawah organization, an Islamic activism organization, an Islamic news organization would want to give back financially.
Yeah.
But rather we find ourselves in where we're in need. Is there a Quranic approach to perhaps changing this model?
So I'll tell you my thoughts on this. The Quran is highlighting the corrupt economic practices of the Quraysh more than anything else. When it criticizes the kuffar, it criticizes their corrupt economic practices. When they were burying the baby girl alive, it's because they didn't want to share a piece of the property with some other tribe that the girl's going to marry into. They were protecting wealth. When they were stealing from the orphan, when they were pushing the orphan around, when they weren't giving ma'un, when they were like al-mutaffifin, those who shortchanged customers in business. Every time the Quran, if you study early Quran, and you study the criticisms in the Quran of the kuffar, their arrogance comes from their wealth and the way they want to hoard their wealth and they want to give it to nobody else, right? So there's this, but the Quran is not saying down with the rich. It's saying this is what you're doing wrong with your wealth, and here's how you make the correct use of your wealth, right? Inheritance, the sa'il and the mahroom, and all of this. Now, Muslims developed an almost Christianized concept of our relationship with wealth. So we developed this idea that akhirah is everything and dunya is nothing.
Live life as a pull
Live life as a, yeah. And this Allah wants you to just not be attached to the dunya in any way. And the Quran is directly going against this Christianized philosophy. Parts of it are Christianized. The Quran is telling the believer, I'll tell you one narration because we have only a few minutes. Do this for yourself. Study the final ayah of Surah Al-Muzammil. Surah Al-Muzammil is so beautiful for many reasons, and primarily because it is the Quran's key to what spirituality means. What does it mean to be connected to God? Right? And this is the alternative to the Christian spirituality, Jewish spirituality, Hindu spirituality, Muslim spirituality, Surah Al-Muzammil. And it starts with a very high standard. Stand in the middle of most of the night, stand and do tahajjud, right? But by the end of the surah, Allah says, I know most of you can't do that. What? Like, you just started with like the gold standard. Here's the gold medal for the Olympics. I know you can't get there, but you should still play some sports, right? And then he gets realistic about the majority of us. And when he gets realistic, he says, and I know that some of you may not be able to do even that because you are يَضْرِبُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَبْتَغُونَ مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ. They are traveling in the world, pursuing Allah's favor, meaning they're doing every tafsir of this ayah is they're going and doing business. And then he says, وَآخَرُونَ يُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, and others are fighting in the path of Allah. So he puts people who are doing business and people who are fighting in the path of Allah. If my memory serves me correctly, it's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's narration. It could be another Sahabi. But in the tafsir of this ayah, you find an amazing narration. He says, the best kind of death I can have is I was fighting in the path of Allah and I died, a shaheed. And the second best kind of death I can have is I have my goods to sell on my mule on a journey to seek the favor of Allah, and I died on the way. Like, just think about that for a moment. Whenever you heard, I was like, 1 month ago, I heard this for the first time. And I've never heard this from the minbar. And you know why he said? He explained why he said it. He said it because the ayah puts pursuing the favor of Allah and fighting in the path of Allah together. And he says, look, these are both blessed by Allah.
To wrap up,
yeah,
what's happening with Bayyinah? Any updates? I know you're going to release Bayyinah TV 2.0.
Yeah, 2.0 came out.
Which there's going to be a discount for if you put 5 pillars, it'll be in the comment section.
Oh, okay, very cool. Yeah.
I just told you about the discount.
Oh, yeah, I'm so aloof. What's happening with Bayyinah? Well, the most exciting thing that's happening with Bayyinah is my own Quranic studies with my team. I think I was kind of making progress at this trajectory, and now I'm sort of making progress at this trajectory. So
what happened there?
Yeah. So just more people involved and more a deeper engagement with critical questions. So we're investigating things in a lot more three-dimensional ways. And that's just, it's opened up so much profound insight. And of course, I see myself now as, because I'm producing the material, right, for Bayyinah. So I see myself as the IP, if you want to call it that.
Okay.
And so the more I invest in myself, the better service I'm providing. So in my furthering myself in my learning, my education, and learning new things that I didn't have access to before, and tapping into scholarship that I didn't have access to before has become a top priority for me. And I'm realizing that I just genuinely feel Quran deserves that. Quran deserves that, the best of what I can give and my team can give. So alhamdulillah, very proud of the team, very proud of especially the research team that is helping, and the scholars that are lending a hand. Every time I need help, there's a number of scholars I can dial into and say, hey, help me with this, help me with this, help me with this. Still some unanswered questions. And the unanswered questions are not, they don't give me anxiety, they give me excitement because that just means there's a lot of oceans to explore, So that's what's coming for Bayyinah, inshallah, and that's something that hopefully leaves a legacy of people wanting to explore the Quran more deeply, inshallah.
When you visit the UK next?
I'm not thinking about that right now.
But give us some more than an hour next time.
I will, yeah. I'll totally give you more than an hour, inshallah. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
Brothers, sisters, and friends, I hope you'll thoroughly enjoy today's discussion as much as I did. Do remember that you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you tune in via YouTube, click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.